Naomi Judd was more than a country music legend. She was the heartbeat of one of America's most beloved families. But when she died, everything changed. Her death in the most tragic of circumstances left the Judd family shattered. However, her daughter Ashley has broken her silence, revealing what really happened in those final days. The world saw a mother and a daughter rise to fame, but behind the music and the awards was a much darker truth, a story of pain, silence, and an ending no one saw coming. The truth is finally out, and it's devastating. Naomi Judd wasn't born into fame, and she certainly didn't stumble into it. Her journey was a complicated mix of heartbreak, reinvention, and resilience that began long before she ever picked up a microphone. Born Diana Ellen Judd on January 11, 1946, in Ashland, Kentucky, she grew up in a small Appalachian town with deep musical roots. Life was simple, but not easy. The family experienced an early tragedy with the death of her younger brother, Brian, from Hodgkin's lymphoma at just 17 years old, a loss that stayed with her forever. By the time she turned 18, Naomi's life had taken a dramatic turn. She became a single mother to her first daughter, Diana Judd, born Christina Claire Simonella in 1964. Her short marriage to Diana's legal father, Michael Simonella, didn't last. A few years later, she gave birth to her second daughter, Ashley Judd. Now a single mother of two young girls, Naomi was determined to build a better life for her family, even if it meant doing it alone. She had no wealth or safety net. Raising Diana and Ashley was far from easy. Naomi juggled multiple jobs, including work as a waitress and secretary, while also enrolling in nursing school. This period of her life was defined by grit and sacrifice. She often described how she would come home from grueling hospital shifts and spend her evenings helping Diana with homework, cooking dinner from scratch, and piecing together second-hand clothes for her daughters. Money was always tight, but her love and determination kept the family together. In the late 1970s, Naomi packed up the family and moved to Los Angeles, hoping to give her daughters better opportunities. While living there, she continued working in healthcare, trying to provide some sense of stability. But Los Angeles didn't offer the long-term answers she was hoping for. Eventually, she made the bold decision to relocate once again, this time to Nashville, Tennessee, the heart of the country music world. It was 1979, and she was in her early 30s. When they arrived in Nashville, Naomi continued working as a nurse to support the household, but something had shifted. By this point, she had started to recognize her daughter Diana's incredible vocal talent. The two had always sung together casually, often harmonizing to old country songs in the kitchen or in the car. But Naomi saw potential in their combined sound. With her medical job as the family's financial backbone, she began networking, studying the music industry, and finding every opportunity for Diana and herself to break into the local music scene. And what happened next would change everything. In the early 1980s, Naomi managed to secure an audition at RCA Records, a major turning point that would launch them into superstardom. At the time, she was working as a nurse for a doctor whose patient had music industry ties. Using her charm, determination, and a homemade demo tape, she convinced executives to hear them sing live. What they heard was something raw and unique, Diana's soulful, emotionally resonant voice backed by Naomi's smooth, steady harmony. It didn't take long for RCA to sign them as a duo, and from that moment on, they became the Judds. The success of the Judds was almost immediate and overwhelming. Their style was refreshing, rooted in traditional country with a modern flair that set them apart from the rest of the genre. Naomi, always dressed in prairie skirts and soft curls, exuded a warmth and maternal strength on stage. On the other hand, Diana, who was bold and expressive, carried the lead with an unforgettable voice. The mother-daughter chemistry was palpable, and fans quickly connected with their authenticity. Their debut EP, Diana and Naomi, was a commercial success, and even featured a hit song that shot to #1 on the Billboard Hot Country Singles chart in 1984. From there, they launched into an extraordinary run of success. Between 1984 and 1991, the Judds earned 14 #1 hits on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart. Their artistry was recognized by Grammy Awards, Country Music Association Awards, and American Music Awards. They performed to sold-out arenas, dominated country music radio, and helped define a generation of family-friendly country storytelling. But what often gets overlooked in Naomi's story is how fiercely independent she was. Even before the fame, long before spotlights and record deals, Naomi was already forging her own path. She didn't wait for life to happen. She made hard choices and kept moving. But what the world didn't see beneath the awards, applause, and carefully controlled public image was a growing darkness Naomi carried within. And in the years after the Judds' final tour, that darkness would begin to take over. Behind Naomi Judd's celebrated music career was a private world few people ever truly understood. After years of touring and standing in the spotlight, Naomi's public image had become synonymous with strength and survival. But after she stepped away from performing in the early 1990s, a very different chapter of her life began, marked by physical pain, psychological trauma, and an unrelenting battle for peace of mind. In 1990, Naomi was diagnosed with hepatitis C, a potentially life-threatening illness she believed she contracted during her years working as a nurse. At the time, medical treatments for the disease were limited and often ineffective. The diagnosis came as a shock, not only because of its severity, but also because it forced her to make a decision she never imagined facing, leaving the music industry at the height of her success. At just 45 years old, Naomi officially retired from performing, ending the touring life she had built with Winona over the previous decade. For fans, the announcement was heartbreaking. But for Naomi, it marked the beginning of an entirely new struggle that played out mostly in silence and far from the public eye. Determined to do more than just endure her illness, Naomi channeled her energy into founding the Naomi Judd Education and Research Fund, a nonprofit aimed at raising awareness and funding research into hepatitis C. It was a way to turn her diagnosis into something larger than herself, to help others understand a disease that was often misunderstood and stigmatized. But while she became a public advocate, her private pain was far more difficult to address. In the years that followed, Naomi began to experience an even deeper and more debilitating challenge, a prolonged and complex battle with mental illness. What began as episodes of depression soon evolved into a cycle of treatment-resistant depression, anxiety, panic attacks, and PTSD. Despite access to some of the best doctors and treatment programs available, she found little lasting relief. At her worst, Naomi's struggles became so severe that she withdrew almost entirely from daily life. There were periods when she wouldn't leave the house for weeks. Even basic routines like getting dressed and speaking to loved ones became difficult. By 2016, she chose to publicly share her mental health journey in a memoir titled River of Time. The book offered an unflinching look at what she had endured since retiring from the stage. She admitted to long periods of immobilizing despair and chronic emotional pain that made daily life feel unbearable. She didn't use clinical language or try to soften the truth. Instead, she focused on telling people what it really felt like to live with a brain that refused to cooperate. She emphasized that what people saw on stage, the confidence, the strength, and the glamour, was just one part of her story. And in the final chapter of her life, as the music world prepared to honor her legacy, Naomi would face a moment of unimaginable pain that would bring her story to a heartbreaking end. In the weeks leading up to her death, Naomi Judd was preparing for what should have been one of the most meaningful moments of her life. After decades of contributions to country music, the Judds were finally set to be inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. It was a long-awaited recognition for the legacy she had helped build with her daughter Winona. Behind the scenes, however, Naomi was facing an overwhelming internal storm. Though she had continued her advocacy and appeared publicly from time to time, her mental health had once again begun to decline. Those closest to her noticed the signs of withdrawal, despair, and moments of deep emotional struggle. Naomi was still seeking treatment, still fighting to hold on, but the depression that had plagued her for years had returned with painful intensity. On April 30th, 2022, just one day before the Hall of Fame ceremony, Naomi's life came to an abrupt and heartbreaking end. She was 76 years old. Her death was reported publicly as a loss to mental illness and occurred under extremely tragic circumstances at her home in Lapers Fork, Tennessee. It was a moment that stunned the music world and left her family shattered. That morning, her daughter Ashley Judd had come to visit, a routine that had become part of their close relationship. At some point, Naomi had sent a short message asking for help. When Ashley arrived, she found her mother in a state of visible distress, restless, packing, and expressing her pain. It was not the first time Naomi had spoken those words, but that day felt different. The heaviness in her demeanor made it clear that the emotional pain had reached a breaking point. Ashley stayed close, trying to offer comfort and reassurance, not knowing how little time was left. At one point, Naomi walked upstairs, and moments later, Ashley followed, only to discover the unthinkable. What followed was a wave of emotion no daughter should ever have to endure. In those final moments, Ashley sat beside her mother, held her hand, and tried to find some sense of peace in an otherwise traumatic experience. She later spoke publicly about how much she loved Naomi, how beautiful she looked even in that moment, and how deep the loss would remain in their lives. Her words were, "We just breathed together, and I talked to her and told her how much I loved her, and it's okay to go." The Judds family released a statement shortly after Naomi's passing, confirming that she had been lost to the disease of mental illness. They chose not to focus on the method, but instead on the decades-long battle that Naomi had fought quietly and courageously. What made Naomi's passing even more heartbreaking was the timing. Just one day later, on May 1st, 2022, Winona and Ashley attended the Country Music Hall of Fame induction ceremony where Naomi was honored posthumously. Through tears, they stood on stage and accepted the award that their mother had dreamed of receiving. It should have been a moment of celebration. Instead, it became a moment of mourning where the family had to balance public recognition with private grief. But even as Naomi's daughters stood side by side in front of cameras and fans, some people began to notice that grief doesn't always unite, but can also quietly divide. And in the weeks after Naomi's death, whispers of tension began to emerge, hinting at a complicated dynamic between Winona and Ashley that even decades of family history couldn't easily mend. In the immediate aftermath of Naomi Judd's passing, the image of her daughters standing together at the Country Music Hall of Fame induction left a powerful impression. Dressed in black, eyes swollen with tears, they accepted their mother's award with a poise that was both admirable and deeply painful to watch. It was barely 24 hours after losing Naomi. Yet, Winona found the strength to walk on stage, honoring a moment their mother had been anticipating for years. Her message was clear: the show wouldn't stop. Her voice might be filled with grief, but it would not be silenced. In the days that followed, Winona turned to social media to share her grief more intimately. On Instagram, she posted a heartfelt tribute, expressing her disbelief and devastation. Her words carried a tone of both reflection and resistance, as if she was willing herself to keep going. She wrote that this cannot be how the Judds' story ends, and many fans could feel the depth of her sadness between the lines. For Winona, Naomi's death seemed to open a floodgate of emotion that had been building quietly over time. She later shared how she found glimpses of hope in music, in family, and in her own resilience. But over time, fans and observers began to notice subtle signs that not everything between Winona and Ashley seemed aligned. Despite their united front at the Hall of Fame ceremony, the emotional processing of Naomi's death appeared to take different shapes for each sister. Winona, as the daughter who shared the stage and business with Naomi for years, seemed to carry a distinct weight tied to their musical bond and the long hours on the road that sometimes came at the cost of closeness. She later spoke about feeling disconnected from her mother in the years before Naomi's death. Touring, professional pressures, and the natural tensions of a mother-daughter partnership had created an emotional distance. Beyond the grief, Winona was also juggling personal responsibilities that few outside the family fully understood. Her daughter Grace had faced legal challenges that resulted in incarceration, and Winona had stepped in to raise her granddaughter. At a time when she was trying to process her own mother's death, she was also navigating the emotional demands of parenting a young child, managing a career, and holding her family together under public scrutiny. As the weeks passed, quiet speculation began to surface about a potential rift between Winona and Ashley. Reports emerged that the sisters were allegedly in disagreement over Naomi's estate, including decisions about property, memorial plans, and legacy projects. While neither sister confirmed a public dispute, the rumors fed into a larger narrative about how grief, fame, and family complications can collide in difficult ways. Some insiders suggested that Ashley, having been the one to physically discover their mother on that devastating day, had taken on a more protective stance regarding Naomi's memory. Winona, on the other hand, seemed focused on honoring Naomi's career legacy through music and performance. Their approaches, while not necessarily at odds, were different, and in grief, differences can sometimes feel like divides. And then, after months of silence and unanswered questions, Ashley Judd finally opened up. In her own words, she revealed what really happened after her mother's tragic death and what she believes the world needs to understand about her mother, her family, and the truth behind that unimaginable day. In the months following Naomi Judd's passing, the world turned to Ashley Judd for answers. As the daughter who found her mother and stood at the center of a very public tragedy, Ashley held not only the memories of that day, but also the deep emotional burden of explaining it to the world. For Ashley, it wasn't about headlines or attention. It was about truth, healing, and honoring her mother's complex journey. From the very beginning, Ashley was open about the trauma. She was the last person to speak to Naomi. She comforted her mother in those final moments, expressing love and understanding, hopping to ease Naomi's pain even as the unthinkable unfolded. That tender, brief, and deeply emotional conversation became one of Ashley's final memories of her mother. In the wake of Naomi's passing, Ashley's public statements remained grounded in compassion and honesty. She refused to gloss over the harsh realities of mental illness or hide behind the stigma that so often surrounds such losses. As part of her own healing process, Ashley turned to eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, a trauma-focused method used to treat PTSD. The goal was not to forget what happened, but to process it and to allow the brain to make sense of pain that often defies logic. It was for Ashley a way to work through the shock and grief while also preserving the love and humanity that existed between her and Naomi. Public curiosity often lingered on the Judd's family dynamics, especially given the intense media attention after Naomi's death. But Ashley was clear and consistent in her message. Her relationship with Winona had grown stronger, not weaker. Despite speculation of tension, both sisters emphasized their shared commitment to honoring their mother's legacy and maintaining family unity. Ashley explained that their bond had been forged through shared history, grief, and a mutual desire to support one another, even when that meant embracing their differences. Winona herself had once described her relationship with Ashley as funny, not in the humorous sense, but in its uniqueness. She once said, "I raised Ashley. That's why we have such a funny relationship, because she calls me Sister Mommy." And after Naomi's death, they leaned on each other, choosing closeness over conflict. Ashley's advocacy took on new urgency in the months that followed. She began speaking out more boldly on mental health prevention and the need for compassionate, trauma-informed care. She partnered with organizations dedicated to reducing the stigma around mental illness, using her platform to amplify conversations many families are too afraid to have. For Ashley, telling the truth wasn't just about setting the record straight. It was about ensuring that her mother's legacy included her battles as well as her brilliance. She believed Naomi deserved to be remembered in full as a talented performer, a loving mother, a woman who gave everything to her family and her fans, and someone who also lived with intense psychological pain. In the end, Ashley didn't want her mother to be remembered for the way she died, but for the life she led, the love she gave, and the truths she dared to face. What would you love to see Ashley Judd and Winona Judd collaborate on? Drop your answers in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen.